you. Good afternoon. It's like being back in Baltimore too. So I think it's wonderful to be up here. I think all the problems are very, very similar. So I'm gonna share with you a little bit about a project we started at the beginning of last academic year. And in terms for me as someone with an academic position, this has been enlightening in many different ways, and it's also outside the norm of the kind of work that one would normally do at a university. And so part of that is because I'm affiliated with BERC, the Baltimore Education Research Consortium, my colleague Faith, who's the executive director. And it really sits at this nexus of what I think this conference is about bringing research and practitioners and working together on problems. And also this project too, I think is potentially powerful because I'm not the one that's doing the research always, right? I'm there to help facilitate people on the ground taking ownership and agency and empowering, which is what I think one of the major takeaways of this project was to do your own research. You have the capability to do it. So we did this work also with colleagues at Morgan State University in Baltimore. So we're basically really brief. What is improvement science, at least in this context? What was the goal of our project? Really talk about what school goals were, because we spent a lot of time there just defining things. And then what did we learn? So here's my really brief one slide, improvement science, right? It's this kind of iterative cycle of let's talk about what are we going to do. So that's a plan session. And hopefully that comes from a position of knowledge. So often before we even begin planning, we need to learn what is the state of our problem. So for us, I'm going to speak a lot about one specific high school, a non-selective neighborhood high school. What do we know about attendance? And actually we really started at what do we know about kids failing mathematics in 9th grade? And we got them to work towards, well, that's a big problem. And we're going to touch a lot of potentially hot topics there when we talk about instruction. What if we step back? What potentially contributes to course failure in the 9th grade? Well, we've also got a chronic absenteeism problem, right? We've got a tardiness problem. Why don't we start there, right? So that's before we get to our plan stage, right? It's using data to help us really get our heads around what our problem is. That took about 4 months for us working with this one school. Then we start talking about what are we going to do? So there's some more data gathering there. There's lots of options we can do. We can pull things off the shelf. We can try something, good idea from Miss Jones down the hall. What are we going to do about it? Hopefully that also comes from a place of knowledge. Well, what do we know about our students? If we're talking about attendance, where's the big problem? Is it they not navigating transportation well? Is it they're leaking off the bus and over to McDonald's? Is it a problem of them leaving school early? So where's that problem? Then we decide what we might do about it. Then important, because this is kind of if you're thinking of a wheel, it's the foot kicking the wheel. What did we learn from everything we did? So we need to have data in place to help us understand what did we actually accomplish, if anything. And actually in this work, failure is really important, failing often and failing quickly, so that we learn what doesn't work, so that we don't spend a lot of time in that space. And then we can also go back into the cycle, and I probably messed up the cycles, but that's the general gist, right? At every point, there's some data collection, and it's kind of driving decision-making about what's the next step in this. And then hopefully we take what we learned and we move a little bit higher. We learn something good, we either develop it more, or we learn that this doesn't work, let's not spend any more time here. And so we move on to another set of data. So hopefully when these things get going, you can rapidly iterate through change ideas that are backed up by a knowledge base about students in a school, and then also reinforced by data. And I tell my students all the time, I overrun my slides, so I probably already said this. But I think some of the things that really caught our eye about this is the bottom one. This way of addressing problems is potentially really empowering for folks on the ground. Right? It gives voice to people. It allows them to be agents in their own solving of their problems, which is critical. Once you reach that kind of stage, you get some really good ideas, and you get people invested in seeing them through and seeing, can we find a solution? Another big thing that came up to us, and it was, I think, part of what took a long time, was the data, right? Data is underneath all of the improvement science work, and we feel like often in districts and schools, there's data everywhere. Schools are data generating things, right? There's tons of data. We're talking about attendance. It happens every single day, happens every single period. There's lots of data points there. But often we have to think creatively about how to use it. Often data gets turned into metrics, right, which are good for accountability. It helps us know where we are and set targets and goals. But on the ground, data might need to look differently. It might have to be a very different thing, even though we can roll it up and get to accountability. But for change and improvement, data looks somewhat different. So on our end, I think a goal was, can we even do this? You know, we see the work coming out of Carnegie, we see the work out in the business field. This is not new ideas. Can we get this to work in Baltimore? Can we learn how to do this? Because it really kind of captured our, wow, there's a good, easy sell here. It sounds like it should be wonderful. Can we actually get it to work in some high schools in Baltimore? We're going to talk about, there were a couple of things that really bubbled up over the course of the year. You can see them there. I'll go into them, just jump right in. So one of the big things was getting the team together in the very first place. Often, we all know this, high schools have teams of staff, faculty, administrators that work together on certain defined problems. So those teams are existing. Those weren't always the best team to begin with. So maybe a school improvement team, you might think logically that's the place to go. The attendance team might be the place to go. They're not always necessarily the best place because they already have an agenda, they have things they must do. And this improvement science requires a bit of stepping back, ability to pause and rethink some ways of doing things. The other thing is that whatever the improvement team is, it needs somebody that has enough power, right? Power in the sense of they can cajole people to get on board or to stay the course or to follow it through, and also get things to happen in a school, right? So one example, we're working with an AP, and he was positioned at the right level, right? So he's responsible for an entire cohort of students. He has sway with some teachers. He knows who would be good on the team. He can pull them in and keep them in. And he can also get an audience with the principal to get some actual things changed. So that's a good thing. The other big thing is trust. Absolutely. Without trust, this doesn't work. And it's trust on the level of, I'm Mr. Johns Hopkins researcher coming into your school. There's a trust building that has to happen at coming in as an outsider to your school environment. And also trust within teams, right? Organizations are full of people that trust to some degree or not. And the team has to trust each other because you have to be able to put out an idea, go out and test it, and watch it fail miserably, and then pick it up and do it again. That requires a high level of trust on these teams that sometimes may or may not be there. And so that was partly our role, was to help facilitate that, but also at the same time, we had to get trusted too. And that took time. It takes a lot of attention. It takes being in the school. And also we found that for us, coaches need to talk to each other, right? So while we were working in 3 high schools with slightly different problems, there was a lot of commonality between what we were experiencing and what our teams were experiencing. And when we could come together and collaborate, we could solve problems for all 3 of our teams. In terms of defining problems, I already hinted at most of our teams started really high, right? They started at a real pervasive problem. Our kids are not being successful in 9th grade mathematics and other coursework, and we know that leads to potentially bad outcomes for kids. But that was not manageable for this. That problem is so multi-threaded, and there are multiple avenues of why kids are not passing courses. It's at too large a grain size for this work. So really spending that time and developing, well, what is the problem? There's several tools in improvement science to help teams get to that. Asking why 5 times is a very simplistic one, but it tends to work. you keep asking why, and as you roll back, you get closer and closer to some root type problem that you can spend a sufficient amount of time on. So that took months often. And also the other part is solutions that masquerade as the problem, right? So people come with the solution pre-built that, well, we're going to work on making, intervention X work better. That's our improvement science project. Well, no, actually, we should be focusing on problems, not on the solutions per se. For example, one of our teams had a homegrown kind of intervention with girls, and they spent a lot of time trying to improve that and never took a critical step early on to say, is this really what we want to do to talk about our attendance problems, right? So they came with the solution already preloaded, and it took a long time to get them to even explore other avenues potentially. Right. I think for me, of course, I'm a bit of a data geek, so this one really resonated with me. We struggled mightily with how do we measure what's happening on a real time, as real time as we can get. Like I said, attendance is collected every day, every period on every kid, hopefully. But that data doesn't exist in a space where, for example, our AP could just immediately pull up a list of the 60 kids he's most worried about, right? So in meetings, if we're talking and we get to this place where, tardiness and class cutting, an aside is I built him a little tool, I did a what if with him. What if every kid who showed up in your building, which we realized that the chronic absenteeism is embedded in kids skipping. What if we gave every kid who showed up, and most of them show up every day, what if we gave them one more period? What would your chronic absentee rate look like? What would their absentee look like? And it dropped 10 percentage points, right? So think about that. That's because of the way it's calculated, right? You can get a half or you can get a whole. So that thinking like that, becoming creative about data, wow, if we could get one more period of attendance out of each, we could focus on that. That's manageable. We could get a big improvement in attendance overall. But that data lives in these big student management systems, right? And they're not easily extractable by people on the ground. They're not even easily extractable by me, right? They're built to shuttle data up to the district for accountability purposes, and often it comes back down. But often it comes back down in a form that's maybe a month old, maybe it's not in a time period where someone can use it. So we built a tool for our principal to take this, he could run a report. I said, can I see a kid you're worried about, what's their daily attendance and by period, right? It's a very simple little data table. It comes out in a format of strings, right? So it's not manipulable as numeric data. And it has lots of cell padding. So whoever the vendor was built a tool to look pretty, but not useful in an on-the-ground kind of level. So that's a very simple change. It's not very simple, but it's simple in concept. So we built a tool to where he could drop in that report, and it would spit out real data, real numeric data that he could actually work with. So that's what we mean by data for improvement. Data that someone can immediately go to. We were there this morning. He knows he realized in the system he could see repeat ninth graders, their attendance was, his on-time kids, their attendance was around 75%, which is really good for the school at the time. His repeat ninth graders was around 30. Major difference, right? We need to work on these kids, but I need to be able to identify them. He couldn't then take the next step and say, these are the 66. Right. He knew there were 66, but he couldn't identify who they were through the system. So that's data for improvement. He would be able to go in immediately, identify those kids immediately, and look at their whole attendance records. So some of the things we accomplished, I might tongue-in-cheek say we learned a lot, but we learned through failure, right? We failed a lot. It was difficult work that went back and forth. But we actually did do some pretty neat things, I think, with these schools. And the school I'm specifically talking about mostly, we're still working with them, right? So that first year that we spent with this technical assistance, I think we built a level of trust with the AP to where he now asks us things. He asks us to continue helping him. Excuse me. He got his principal on board to move the work forward. We're now a member of their attendance team to help them think these things through. So I think we were successful. It's just that I think in a lot of educational spaces, the game is really long. We like to think that we'll find short answers, but the game takes time to build up to potential progress. So this data culture, this accountability versus improvement data, part of our work where we sit between the district and schools too. So helping everyone see that difference and how do we come up with solutions to get to data that schools can use. Often it's just bringing a new perspective. How can I look at this differently, right? So we talked about attendance. Well, we're at a certain level of chronic absenteeism. We're good. We're not below the threshold of where accountability kicks in. Well, that's a different perspective than saying, oh, we've got 40 kids that are really close to becoming chronically absent. What do we do about them now? And I think our schools started to make that kind of mental change. The really focusing on skipping. We spent a whole attendance meeting this morning before we came up here, and they focused on how do we deal with that, right? So the team generated several ideas. They're going to carry them out. We then talked about how can we measure it? How can we see where the state is before you do these interventions, and then what happened as a direct result? So we're finally at the point where we're going to get the little cycles at the first. We're probably going to get our first real one done pretty soon, right? It took that long to get it to that place. Process mapping. Another school had a problem with hall walking. So working through a process map of why does that happen? How does that happen? What's the flow chart of how kids enter and leave classrooms? How do hall passes get transmitted between teachers? That's actually really powerful because it lays out that some people have different processes in their head, even though it's supposedly the same process. Another example of that is the bottom one. We met with a group of teachers talking about a tardiness. And a very simple question. What is tardy in your class? And there were 10 teachers and there were 10 different answers. And tardy has consequences in every single one of their classes, right? So think about what that means for a kid. I'm a kid, I cannot expect a consistent definition of tardy, and I get a consequence from it, right? So that, we only get there through this process in some way, at least that we did, or you can get there many ways. But just laying that out, and in a room with 10 teachers and they all realize they have 10 different systems is really important, because then you can't ignore that when it's kind of like it's laying out there, and how do we deal with it? One upshot of that, this school had one bell. That's where the genesis of that question. So they had one bell for passing. So there was no actual signal to kids to get into the room. And that's why there were 10 different tardies, right? Because how do I know? Well, when do I start? Well, I start when there's enough kids to start, those types of things. They have 2 bells now. Small, it sounds ridiculously small, but it's ridiculously important. Right? These small, consistent processes are really, really important. So there's a lot of other things about that, but I think it's one of those things. I've never been energized about something like that, like right in a school, that I see the key is empowering people to to assume the agency they actually have in school buildings and supporting them with data to do that. So thank you.